Hey class, so this lecture is for you if you missed the lecture on Thursday because you were in Disneyland, or if you have me on Fridays and I wasn't there because I was sick. So this is just putting this up there so you have access to everything. I'm going to try to go through this relatively quickly so you don't have too much more to add on to your already heavy workload. So we're going to be talking about the civil rights movement in the 60s, right? We talked a lot about the 1950s and the start of the civil rights movement with Brown versus Board of Education, with the Montgomery bus boycotts, with the desegregation of Little Rock, but we're starting to see this pick up once again in the 1960s. Now, in terms of background to politics, John F. Kennedy is going to be our president in the 1960s. He beats out Richard Nixon in the 1960 election very narrowly. He wins by 0.1% of the popular vote. But he does overwhelmingly win in the electoral vote, in the electoral college. Kennedy is young. He is our first and only, actually, Catholic president. And he will run against Richard Nixon, who had been Eisenhower's vice president. JFK was inexperienced. He was only 43. He's actually the youngest president to ever be elected. Teddy Roosevelt actually is the youngest president ever because he took office from after McKinley was shot when he was 42, but he wasn't elected when he was 42. So JFK will be the youngest elected president. Although Nixon has the experience, JFK runs a very good campaign, and he is charming and appealing to the majority of the population. One of the most commonly talked about factors in terms of Kennedy's win here are the televised Kennedy-Nixon debates. They were some of the first televised debates, and you know the whole story goes is Kennedy allowed them to put stage makeup on him, whereas Nixon was like, no, I'm not going to wear makeup. Like, the women wear makeup. That's absurd. And so when they went on television, Kennedy looked, handsome and healthy and all of that, whereas Nixon looked kind of like sweaty and sickly and whatever. And so people who listened to the debate on the radio thought Nixon won, and people who watched the debate on television thought Kennedy won. Now, in recent years, we have studied that a little bit more. We sort of skip over the demographics when looking at that. So, younger viewers who tended to like Kennedy also tended to watch TV, whereas older viewers who tended to like Nixon tended to listen to it on the radio. So it's not a perfectly accurate survey or poll after, but still that idea that television matters, your persona on television matters, your charisma, your look, your style matters, that really is going to permeate politics after the Kennedy-Nixon debates. So Kennedy's incredibly confident. He exudes charm and style. He's young. He's got a beautiful wife. He's got this beautiful family. And so after winning the election, his administration is very much going to be one of idealism and hope. Right? He sets new frontiers and new boundaries that America is going to cross, and he ushers in this new era of rising expectations. He also, his sort of White House is talked about as Camelot, right? So sort of this glorious, wonderful wonderland of a place to be. He's often on his front lawn playing touch football with his kids, right? And his actions and their actions as a whole kind of were idealized, right? This is this perfect version. Now, Kennedy does have some pros, right? He started the Peace Corps. He really upped NASA, so that becomes very essential for national prestige. He helps us avoid nuclear war, which is a big one during the Cuban Missile Crisis. But he also did the Bay of Pigs, right, which did not go over very well, and he allowed for the Berlin Wall to go up. Additionally, Kennedy also has sort of a darker side that we don't talk about as much, but he was having many extramarital affairs, right? We looked at his and his wife's relationship as such a lovely, wonderful nuclear family, but he was sleeping with everybody, like, largely Marilyn Monroe, sort of the most commonly thought one. And then there's a lot of allegations about, illicit activity that's going on in his White House. After hours parties and allegations of a lot of misconduct that we wouldn't be happy with the president doing. But he's remembered as one of the most beloved and most celebrated presidents, and part of that may have had to do with the fact that he was actually killed before people could be disillusioned with him. Right? This commonly happens with presidents where it's like, in the first few years we give them a grace period, we really like them and what they're doing, and then maybe by the end of their presidency we're not as thrilled with the decisions they've with the decisions they've made. But he was only president for about 2 years, and so we were very much, with his death, it sort of memorialized him as this great, wonderful person. Okay, so one of the types of protests that we're going to see early on are sit-ins. Now, sit-ins are first going to become popularized in Greensboro, North Carolina, and these will be a new and very popular way of nonviolent civil disobedience, so a protest of the civil rights movement. Even though the schools have been desegregated, right? Brown versus Board just said that schools had to be desegregated. So now we're seeing step by step, we're going through each area trying to prove, right, separate but equal is unconstitutional, therefore we should desegregate the buses. And now, therefore, we should desegregate the lunch counters. So sit-ins first occur in Greensboro in 1960. 4 Black students go down to sit at the lunch counter and were told, we don't serve Negroes, we serve whites only. They refused to leave. They just said, no, we would like some lunch, please, and continued to sit there. The lunch counter ultimately closes early because they think that this is sort of embarrassing and ridiculous, and so they're just like, fine, we're just going to close, and that will force you to leave. But when the students return to their college, sorry, I am tired. When the students return to their college, they're treated wonderfully by all their friends. They're like, that's a great idea, you guys. So they go back the next day. And rather than having 4 students, there are 30 students. And 30 students sit at the same Woolworth lunch counter. And then once again, the store closes early. The day after that, 50 students come in. And by the end of the week, there are hundreds of students occupying the lunch counter asking to be served. Within 2 months, the sit-in movement had spread to 54 different cities in 9 states, and it was clear that this was spreading very rapidly and was very effective. This is nonviolent civil disobedience, right? You do not react, you do not, hit back, you do not do anything like that, but you simply sit and you break the law purposefully, right? It was illegal to sit at that lunch counter, but they did it anyway because they thought that the law was unconstitutional and they were trying to prove a point. And it worked very well. By July of 1960, so several months later, the original 4 protesters were served lunch at the same Woolworth's lunch counter that had now been desegregated. Other of the protests were not quite as nonviolent, but still successful. So this brings us to the Freedom Riders. So remember, the movement is represented, or sort of the civil rights movement as a whole is represented by court cases that demand desegregation, but even after the law goes into effect, oftentimes it's not enforced. And so until enforcement is upheld, people don't stop doing it, right? So even if we say all bus stations must be desegregated, Alabama's not going to jump super quick and be like, yes, I'm going to desegregate all my bus stops immediately. And so they won't desegregate the bus stations. So the intent of the Freedom Riders was to force these bus stations to desegregate. The law said that they had to desegregate, and therefore they were going to act like they already were desegregated and sort of challenge the federal government to step in and uphold the law. Now, the Freedom Riders will be led by CORE, the Congress of Racial Equality. Now, the 2 other acronyms I'm just going to throw out there for you that you should know are SNCC and the SCLC. So SNCC is SNCC, and that's SNCC, and that stands for the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. And then the SCLC, which is the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, or Congress, sorry. And those 2 are going to be the other major ones. So the SNCC, SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, is more of a youth organization. Same with CORE. They're more of sort of the younger people, lots of students. Whereas the SCLC, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, is a little bit of maybe more of an older generation, right? We see that this is what Martin Luther King's going to be ahead of, a lot more pastors and sort of religious personnel involved. So to speed up the process of desegregation, they come up with the idea of the Freedom Riders. The objective of the Freedom Riders is to provoke the Southern authorities into arresting us and thereby prod the Justice Department into enforcing the law of the land. So basically, the hope is we're going to get arrested, but we didn't actually break the law, so we're going to force the federal government to intervene on our behalf. It's basically testing these laws, right? So they're going to go into bus terminals, which have now said that you have to desegregate, train stations and airports, which have all said that you have to desegregate. But in the South, they hadn't yet. So at each stop, they ignore the white and colored signs in toilets, counters, waiting areas, restaurants, whatever. And they go in just as they normally would, everyone into the same one, or they would sometimes switch. But they completely ignore Jim Crow signs. Now, this is actually not civil disobedience because they have a legal right to disobey segregation. The federal government changed the law, but the states have not yet complied. So they are actually following the law and just trying to force the federal government to actually enforce it in the South, right? They're saying, hey, federal government, Mississippi isn't saying isn't doing what you said that they had to do. Come in and tell them that they have to do it because they're not desegregating. All in all, the reaction is really not pretty to the freedom riders. There is huge amounts of violence. Quite a few bus trips will come down in total throughout this whole process, so it's not just one group of people. But there will be some severe beatings. In Anniston, Alabama, one of the buses is firebombed, and as the passengers escape from the firebombed car, they're met with a whole crowd who are carrying iron bars, clubs, tire chains. They broke the windows, they slashed the tires, and then after beating up all of the riders, the local hospital refused to treat them, saying that, we can't help you here. Ultimately, out of this, one of the riders, who was a 61-year-old professor, was actually left with brain damage that would permanently alter his life. In Birmingham, the riders were so severely beaten, but no police showed up. The police office in Birmingham basically said, oh, it's Mother's Day. We don't work on Mother's Day. Not a single police officer was there to protect them. And then we also see another arrest back in Birmingham at one of the other trips where, once again, the police miraculously disappear and a crowd of 300, which will ultimately swell to over 1,000 whites, attack the 21 riders. In Montgomery, a mob was charged with, once again, sort of attacking and hurting another huge crowd of people. So finally, the Freedom Riders get to this point where there's been so much violence and so much craziness that Kennedy ends up sending down fire marshals for protection. And the federal government finally steps in. And they ban interstate carriers from segregating terminals or any of that. So they get the victory and they get the enforcement. So it worked out very well. Next up, we have James Meredith and the University of Mississippi. So the federal courts had ordered that we needed to have integration in Southern universities, right? Universities needed to integrate, not just high schools or elementary schools, but universities as well. Some had begun the process, but University of Mississippi, or Ole Miss, had not. So James Meredith, who's the guy in the center there, was a Black Air Force veteran, and he was declined admittance in 1962, and he challenged it. Right, he was going to go on the VA bill, and he'd get an education, and he's like, hey, I want to come, it's desegregated now, and they're like, no. And he's like, okay, fine, well, legally I'm allowed to come. So he challenges it. JFK upholds that challenge, and he sends in the National Guard because things had been so tense. So in order to protect him at the school, they send in 3,000 troopers to the university. When Meredith arrives on campus, a riot ensues. The rioters attack the troops. The troops respond with tear gas. They call for 5,000 more reinforcements. And the result is that 3 men are killed, 50 injured, and 6 marshals end up being shot, all over a single person of color attending a university. And the federal government had to force the integration. Otherwise, it wouldn't happen. And that's what we start seeing, right, is the federal government is needing to step in because the South is not changing fast enough. Just because there's forced integration does not mean people are happy about it. And we can see this most well showcased with the case of George C. Wallace, who's the governor of Alabama. Wallace is elected governor in 1962 in a landslide victory, and he takes the oath of office standing on the Gold Star, where 102 years prior, Jefferson Davis had been sworn in as the president of the Confederacy. In his inaugural speech, he used the line for which he is best known. It says, in the name of the greatest people that have ever trod this earth, I draw the line in the dust and toss the gauntlet before the feet of tyranny, meaning the federal government. And I say, segregation now, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever. These lines were written by Wallace's speechwriter, who was a man named Asa Carter, who was a former Klansman. He will also then proceed to attempt to block integration at the University of Alabama and then also at 4 separate elementary schools, all of which resulted in federal marshals being sent in to confront him, overturning this and allowing the students to be sent in. But he gets to sort of hold this up as a, look how good I am for standing up to segregation. And he's going to use that when he eventually runs for president in 1968. One of the trends that we've been looking at, right, is how the media plays a role in the civil rights movement. And this is going to be showcased through Birmingham. So Birmingham, Alabama was chosen very specifically because of the condition of the city and the police force who ran it. Martin Luther King Jr. and the SCLC decided to make Birmingham their next target as to desegregate because they thought that it would be the city that would reveal Southern brutality in the day of light, right? And those images and the video would be sent nationwide, which would help gain support. So this is a very calculated move. Very effective, but calculated. The subsequent protests will see sit-ins throughout Birmingham. So we'll see sit-ins, kneel-ins, which is just oftentimes kneeling outside of the courthouse door, marches through the streets, all protesting segregation. Now, to give you a sense of the level of segregation of the city of Birmingham removed a children's book from their library that depicted a white bunny rabbit and a black bunny rabbit being friends. That's just how deeply ingrained this is that they remove a kid's book that shows a white bunny and a black bunny being friends from their local library. The police chief was a man named Bull Connor, and Bull Connor was kind of a racist, not nice person. And he will react very violently to a lot of the protests that are going on. So after the protest had started, the city ends up obtaining an injunction which would bar any protesting. So they're saying you can no longer protest. Now, why that's important is because with this injunction, the police can now arrest protesters because it is now illegal to protest, whereas before they were just they were using their First Amendment rights. Now, of course, banning protests in this case would be a violation of the First Amendment, but still, they did it. So now they can throw people in jail. We see protesters being arrested by the hundreds. Martin Luther King is actually thrown in prison for a while. He writes while in jail a letter from a Birmingham jail, which becomes very famous. But we start to see, over several weeks, hundreds of protesters keep being thrown in prison, going back out and marching and thrown in prison again. And finally, it gets to a point where there's not enough volunteers to keep protesting, right? Because in many ways, protesting is a luxury. You need to work. You need to feed your family. And if you're taking the day off to go protest, that means you're not making money that day. That means you're not being able to feed your family that day. If you're stuck in jail for several days, same thing. You're not able to work. And so that's going to take a toll on the local population. So what they decide to do is actually call in on the children. And this is what's known as the Children's Crusade. So King calls on high school students and he says, anyone who wants to, we need more people to join the cause, and you high school students would, if you're willing, we would love that. So on the first day, we have 1,000 high school students leaving school. 600 of them are thrown in prison. But on the first day, the police actually used restraint. The second day is what these images are from. And on the second day, the police unleash police dogs and fire hoses on these high school kids who are just protesting against segregation, right? These images go viral. So you can see in that top image, right, we have a guy pulling a police dog or pulling the kid into the police dog so the police dog can bite him. With the fire hoses, so fire hoses can peel bark off of a tree. So at that close of range, that would completely bruise and blister your back. So if you were hit with a fire hose at that range, you would have blue, black, purple blisters all up and down your back. It's not like a fun run through the sprinkler thing. But despite the fire hoses, despite the police dogs, the next day, 2,000 marchers flow in, and this prompts sympathy strikes throughout the country, just like they thought it would, right? When the media shows the images of the kids being brutally attacked, the nation supports the movement, right? So people will show up from out of town to continue to protest. We see sympathy strikes in 200 cities across the South, and all of the protests are once again televised. And once again, the public broadcasting, right, the televised images here cause public outrage, and public outrage forces Kennedy to intervene. So the Kennedy administration actually sent in negotiators to help negotiate between the white business community of Birmingham and the SCLC, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference led by King. On May 10th, they come to an agreement. They agree to desegregate the lunch counters and other public accommodations downtown. They agree to create a committee to eliminate discriminatory hiring practices, and they agree to arrange the release of jailed protesters and to establish the means of communication. Immediately after this as well, JFK is finally going to give a speech in which he calls for comprehensive civil rights legislation. He says, Congress, please write something. Right? Let's just create one act that encompasses everything and desegregates everything all at once. So he calls on Congress in order to pass a big piece of legislation, a big law, right? Hours after his speech, The president of the NAACP, Medgar Evers, was shot and killed in his front yard in Jackson, Mississippi, probably directly in response to Kennedy's speech. By September, we're going to continue to see outrage and backlash to all of the sort of gains made in Birmingham, most infamously known as the 16th Street Baptist Church bombing. KKK members had set a 19 sticks of dynamite in the basement of a major Black Baptist church in Birmingham, and the explosion went off while 26 kids were in Bible study. 4 young Black girls between the ages of 10 and 14 are killed. 22 young kids are also killed or also injured. And this is huge. I mean, how much more, wholesome can you get? You have kids just going to Bible study, and then suddenly their church explodes, and 4 of them are dead, and 22 of them are left bloodied and wounded. The result of this is violence across Birmingham between protests and riots and all of the tension that builds up, and by the end of the day, 2 more African American youth will lay dead as well. In order to only making things worse, 3 days after the tragedy, former Birmingham Police Commissioner Bull Connor goes in front of a crowd of 2,500 people, blaming the kids getting killed on the decisions by the Supreme Court. So he says, if you're going to blame anyone for those children getting killed in Birmingham, it's your Supreme Court, meaning by passing Brown versus Board, that was their fault for killing the kids. He will also say, you're going to have bloodshed, and it's on them, the court, not us. He also proposed that maybe the Black community may have deliberately set the bomb, he says, to provoke an emotional response. He says, I wouldn't say it's above Dr. King's crowd, or he just says King's crowd, he doesn't say doctor, but implying that the Black community had actually set the bomb on the church in order to make people upset. No one is convicted for the bombings until 1977, when new evidence in the case ends up convicting 1 Klans member. The case is reopened again in 2000 with 2 more Klans members convicted. But no, everyone was protected until that point. The march in Birmingham and Kennedy's call for legislation is going to lead to the March on Washington. So the March on Washington, the intent is to urge Congress to pass the Civil Rights Act. Black leaders call for a march. This is going to be the location of King's famous I Have a Dream speech. Essentially, this is sort of the pinnacle of hope. After the speech, the series of speeches, the leaders will meet with JFK in the White House. JFK appears to be sincerely committed to passing the Civil Rights Bill, and they're basically asking for some, basic stuff. They want meaningful civil rights laws, federal works programs, full and fair employment, decent housing, the right to vote, and adequate integrated education. Now, although the March on Washington is celebrated as this huge victory, it wasn't celebrated by everyone. We can see the beginnings of the movement diverging, as evidenced through Malcolm X's quote here. Malcolm X critiques the march, saying, they joined it, became part of it, took over. And as they took over, it lost its militancy. It ceased to be angry. It ceased to be hot. It ceased to be uncompromising. Well, it even ceased to be a march. It became a picnic, a circus. So basically saying, right, criticizing the marches as more people got involved, right, as the march sort of took on a more calm, wider government note, it ceased to do what it was supposed to do, which was be angry and frustrated about the situation that we're in. We're also going to see John Lewis, who was a leader of the SNCC, right, SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. He was going to give a speech, and he ends up being censored by more sort of moderate civil rights leaders, saying it comes off too aggressive and too critical of the government. And so we're beginning to see, the hints of a divergence in the movement, right, a split in the movement. But that march is successful. The Civil Rights Bill will be passed in 1964 and signed into law on July 2nd by President Johnson. Now remember, JFK had been supporting this initially, but after his assassination, he won't have the opportunity to sign this into law, which means his vice president, Johnson, will be the one to do that when he becomes president. With the passage of the bill, the U.S. recognizes that in all states, African Americans are citizens protected by the Constitution, and therefore they are entitled to all of the rights of the Constitution. What this does is outlaw discrimination and segregation in all public accommodations, education, and employment. So hotels, theaters, and restaurants for public accommodation, things like that, and then also extending to education and employment as well. It also gives aid, right? It gives extra money, so an incentive to schools that integrated, saying here, if you want to try this out, we know it's going to be complicated, but we will give you monetary aid, monetary incentive. The one thing missing from this, though, is the right to vote. The Civil Rights Bill does nothing about addressing the right to vote. In response to the lack of voting rights put in here, we see the beginning of Freedom Summer. So Freedom Summer is the summer of 1964, something you should write down. And Freedom Summer is a big push to help register Black citizens to vote. So it's a lot of generally white, middle class, or affluent college kids paying their own way down to the South and using their color and using their position as a strategic means to help, right? So they can accompany African Americans to the polls, help get them registered, help sort of call out, whatever means that people were, whatever intimidation tactics or other means people were using to prevent them from being there. Now, despite the fact that they are white, they are not safe from attack either. So three white civil rights activists will end up being kidnapped and murdered by Klansmen in June of 1964. Their bodies are not found until August. And when their bodies are found, they're found amongst quite a few other African American bodies that were listed as missing persons as well. So they found this huge pile of bodies. The bones of most of the bodies were so severely smashed that the coroner noted that it looks like they could have been in a plane crash. Additionally, throughout Freedom Summer, we will see the beating of 80 additional civil rights workers, 30 people will be shot, 4 killed, 1,000 activists will be arrested on trumped-up charges, 30 Black homes will be bombed and burned, and 37 Black churches will be burned. So the Klan is stepping up the level of violence, right? In response to these changes, we're seeing that sort of Southern Redeemer attitude, right, that Reconstruction attitude come back out and try to force and terrorize people back into what they considered their proper place, right, that second-class citizenship. But this time it's not going to work as well. Luckily, we have the media, and that's going to be partially helpful and responsible for that. By March of 1965, MLK has plotted his sort of next approach, right? And the next goal is going to try to be to get voting rights. And he's going to do this by creating a march from Selma to Montgomery, which is 54 miles, and he's got about 600 marchers. The movie Selma is an excellent one to watch here, or if you've already seen that, you get a sense of this. It does a very good job of showing how the press, the role that the press plays in this. He was being monitored by the FBI, so if you saw that in there, that's why that's there as well. But it's a great film to watch if you want to get a better sense of this. Also because it's sort of past what we consider the heyday or the golden era of the civil rights age, sort of looking at the calculation and the decision-making process that goes into this. Unfortunately, the marchers are stopped in between Selma and Montgomery and beaten severely by state troopers on what becomes known as Bloody Sunday. But people see it, right? Once again, the media will play such an important role. There's images of police on horseback with batons, beating or like smacking down, middle-aged or elderly women who are just running away on the bridge. There's tear gas everywhere. They're beating people who have fallen in place. It's horrible. But that's all televised. Those images are published. And so that's going to garner a national response once again, which will put pressure on Johnson to actually change something. So the Voting Rights Act is finally going to be passed in 1965, partially in response to Selma, and it will give people sort of positive voting rights. So rather than saying you just can't discriminate based on whatever, it's saying no, you can actively vote if you're a citizen. It also does something important, which is it gives federal examiners the power to register voters in states with a history of discrimination, and we have federal intervention here. So there's virtually We're basically allowing the federal government, we're giving them the means to step in states that are resistant to this and help protect voting rights. And we're going to see about half of the adult Black population registered to vote by the end of the summer. Of course, we're also going to see sort of a backlash in the aftermath of this. So one of the big things that we're looking at here, right, is we have this legislation passed. We have the Civil Rights Bill of 1964. We have the Voting Rights Act of 1965. And yet, things still are bad. Right? Yet there's still so many problems. There's still so much violence. There's still so much craziness. So despite some of this legislation, we're still seeing this tension and frustration brought out through riots. One of the biggest riots that we point to is the 1965 Watts riot in LA. in Los Angeles, and this was provoked by the forcible arrest of a young black driver, the clubbing of a bystander by police, and the seizure of a woman who was falsely accused of spitting on the police. And the police brutality that is witnessed here is going to sort of be the trigger button, and it pushes the city into explosion. Over 15,000 troops will ultimately be dispatched to the streets of Los Angeles to combat looting and firebombing of stores and the violence that was taking place. 34 people will end up dead, hundreds injured, and 3,500 people will be arrested by the end of this. Of course, with millions of dollars of property damage. We're also seeing these riots not just confined to LA, but in 1967, we have one of the long, hot summers. And this is a year filled with riots, mostly in the summer, but sort of throughout the year. Interestingly, too, riots are not, in this case, it was not often perpetrated by people in the poorest of ghettos, right, of the poorest of neighborhoods, but rather by people who are right on that cusp between the poorest and the middle class, right, being able to jump up, being able to move up, but continually being pushed back over and over and over again and not being able to quite make it into that middle class status. And so that's where a lot of the frustration is going to come from. They're frustrated with this promise of the civil rights movement that doesn't quite seem fulfilled. So the feeling of hopelessness and frustration and all of that is going to overwhelm everybody. All in all, we will see 8 major riots, 33 serious riots, and 123 minor. They're categorized based off of the amount of damage, the amount of people involved, the length, the amount of people injured, right, things like that. 83 people will die of gunfire. Over 4,000 people will be injured throughout all of this, and of course, billions of dollars of property damage. And it's clear that, things aren't good, and this is just sort of an explosion and an expression of so much hope that seems to continually be let down. So what we're starting to see here, right, is the emergence of Black power. We're starting to see a divide in the movement. People are becoming disillusioned with the fact that nothing is changing, and that's going to be really, really frustrating. So Black power really is going to sort of arise out of, a lot of it comes out of the ideas of Malcolm X, but by the time it really takes off and takes hold, he actually will already have been killed. So he's killed in 1965. And this disillusionment that we talked about that have led to so many riots was developing and showing a dissatisfaction with the nonviolent protests, right? We're sort of like, we've been doing this nonviolent thing, we've been getting the civil rights legislation, but things aren't changing enough, right? There's still not enough being done. There's still all this institutionalized racism. There's still underemployment and substandard schools and segregated slums and police brutality, and none of that is being taken on as a real issue. Additionally, the intense violence is still there, right? We're still seeing people being killed. And the backlash is still absolutely there. And so that's going to lead into this as well. The one other major thing that's taking place during this time is Vietnam, right? So Vietnam is happening simultaneously. So during the summer of 1967 is also the year where we first see the casualties top 11,000. So we have more casualties in 1967 than we had in all of the years combined. We also have the draft in place, right? So American soldiers are being drafted to go overseas, and the way that you can get out of that is by going to college. So we see this as sort of a rich-poor thing, and that gets really frustrating as well because the poor people are being drafted overseas. And so that's going to be the backdrop to this. We have many African-American soldiers bearing a disproportionate amount of casualties early on, but then also, having these huge numbers of people being drafted and sent overseas, and then not feeling like, sort of like, why should I be fighting for this country who treats me so terribly? So once again, this is a trend that we've seen throughout war, right? We saw this throughout World War I, again during World War II. We're seeing this right now during Vietnam, where people are being sent overseas to fight for such wonderful ideals and then coming home to a country that is not taking care of them. We'll see Muhammad Ali, famous boxer, very famously refusing to serve in the armed forces in Vietnam. Creating this international symbol of anti-war sentiment and of Black dissent. But that's sort of one of these other major things that's taking place to allow for the emergence of Black power. So Malcolm X really kind of comes to prominence during the early 1960s. He will ultimately be killed in 1965 by members of the Nation of Islam, although of course there's always conspiracy theories about that. But he supported cultural nationalism, particularly in his early years. He demanded that sort of the U.S. was too corrupted with racism, that the UN should actually intervene in the United States and create separate black states. He thought that we were at a point where we could no longer live successfully next to each other. He called whites blue-eyed devils in his early years, and so this is really going to alienate him from the wider movement. But they kind of talk about this in Selma too, but there's a really interesting, dichotomy here of he sort of recognizes that position later on of being like, Martin Luther King, you're going to make more gains because they fear me. They see me as the alternative, right? Now, after making a trip to Mecca, because he was Muslim, he changed his views very radically. When he saw all of the different people who came together at the Hajj, he felt that Islam could actually erase the racial problems of society, that Islam could really unite people and bring people together because he saw such a successful multiracial community when taking that pilgrimage. And so he mellows out a lot. But essentially his core idea, and the core idea that people are going to latch onto, this idea of black power, is we are nonviolent with people who are nonviolent with us, but we are not nonviolent with anyone who is violent with us. Essentially, this is self-defense, right? If you punch me in the face, I'm going to punch you in the face, right? No longer sitting idly by and taking it, no longer having to do the nonviolent approach where people are spitting at you and screaming at you and all of that. And now it's like, no, I'm going to react. I'm going to stand up for myself. I'm going to respond. And that's really the idea that's going to become more powerful. One of the major sort of turning points in terms of the emergence of black power actually comes after Malcolm X's death in 1965, but comes with the Walk Against Fear in 1966. So if we remember a few slides above with James Meredith, Meredith was the first black man to attend the University of Mississippi. He was the Black Air Force veteran, or Black Army veteran. When he graduated, he decided to walk through the South. He wanted to travel 225 miles from Memphis, Tennessee to Jackson, Mississippi, essentially proving that a black man could simply walk safely through the South without being attacked. He's not protesting in mass. He does not have a big group, right? He's simply walking. And he can't even manage to do that. He takes 2 companions with him, and he makes it 2 days. And 10 miles into the walk on the second day, he's shot by a white man. This is going to mark the emergence of black power and the disillusionment with white liberals and the impatience with black moderate civil rights leaders and the resentfulness surrounding Vietnam, and it's going to lead into black power. Additionally, that same year, so in addition to James Meredith getting shot, we also have a prominent civil rights activist named Sammy Young. Sammy Young was in Alabama, and he demanded to use a whites-only restroom, which at this point was illegal, right? You could not have whites-only restrooms. So he demands to use the white-only restroom, and he ends up getting shot in the head for doing so. So clearly, despite the legislation, there are still major issues. The guy is shot in the head for walking into a legal bathroom. Right? So this all is just more evidence of this disillusionment, of this changing time of all of this. So this leads us into Stokely Carmichael's speech, and he's going to be one of the first people to really talk about black power. Now, Stokely Carmichael was the new leader of SNCC, right? SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. And he's calling for black people in the country to unite, to recognize their heritage, and to all of this. And so he gives a very famous speech. He says, "I'm not going to beg the white man for anything I deserve. I'm going to take it," right? So it's been so long since we've just been asking and asking and waiting and waiting. Now it's time for us to actually stand up and take what we want. He also very famously says, this is the 27th time I've been arrested. I ain't going to jail no more. The only way we're going to stop them white men from whooping us is to take over. We've been saying freedom for 6 years, and we ain't got nothing. What we're going to start saying now is black power. Right? So it's time for us to stand up. We're not just going to sing freedom anymore. We're going to stand up, and we're going to take what we want, and we're going to react. Now, this is a very natural response, right? And this makes a lot of sense, but it doesn't go over very well among the white community. People are kind of freaked out. Part of this is because of the idea that we were going to exclude the white community here, and so they do this. Both SNCC and CORE expel all of their white members, and the idea is like, look, we don't really know who we even are as a people, right? For so long, we've been living among this sort of white society who have these certain expectations for us. And in order to build this sense of blackness and black consciousness, many civil rights organizations begin to exclude whites, right? So it's sort of like we can figure out who we are and what we are and all of that without having to feel intimidated by whites, right? We have to find a climate where we can do this, where we can be successful. But this really freaks people out. One of the other major symbols of this is going to be the Black Panther Party. Now, the Black Panther Party is actually founded in Oakland in 1967 by Bobby Seale and Huey P. Newton, and they are very much a grassroots movement. And they are working, they're a very working class movement, right? A very radical movement that comes out of the cities that the riots had taken place in. And so this is part of a larger civil rights movement, but it's going to be sort of a really unique and interesting aspect here. So the Black Panthers identified themselves with wearing black leather. They saluted by raising their hands stiff above their head with their fists clenched, with black gloves and black berets, as we can see right here. And they come up with a 10-point program. So they start out as very much this grassroots movement who begins arming themselves and begins unifying for community defense. They are not nationalists. They're not trying to separate. They are simply trying to protect themselves and organize the young, poor community. So their 10-point program demands several things. It's actually in the back of your reader if you would like to flip to it and read through it. It says that education that teaches us our true history should be included, right? So keep in mind, we're in the 60s. You guys are, people growing up in the 60s were not getting the type of education that you guys are now, particularly in regards to U.S. history. So it's asking for a different discussion, a more accurate discussion of what U.S. history was. They wanted black offenders tried by black juries. They wanted black men exempted from military service until things in the United States had been solved. And they actually called for the UN to also intervene in America. And they also preached self-defense. This is going to be a big one. Now, the big preach for self-defense was to combat police brutality and to create an armed neighborhood watch. So they legally possessed all of their weapons, right? And so they would arm themselves and patrol the neighborhood and keep an eye on the cops and make sure that the cops were not doing something to the community that they felt was out of line. There was, violence to little extent, but the media really exaggerates this, which causes them to be major police and FBI targets. Ultimately, they're actually going to end up on the on the top 10 watch list for terrorist organizations by the FBI because they were worried about black men with guns, essentially. The FBI ends up infiltrating the Black Panthers. They're so worried about this that they end up infiltrating the Black Panthers, and they take them down. And the Black Panthers get completely discredited by the actions of the FBI. They begin selling drugs and gun running and creating bar fights and doing all this stuff, which makes them seem like a gang versus a community organizing group, which is kind of sad. The Black Panthers also really started community programs. That was one of their big things. They created local newspapers. They organized free breakfasts. They held medical clinics, political education classes, right? So trying to get the community, make sure the community knew their rights, were educated, were literate. They would do breakfasts and daycares for little kids whose, families may not be able to take care of them. So they were really trying to support and protect their local community. The Panthers were also much less of nationalists, right? They're not they don't want to racially divide the country. They believe that we can all coexist. They actually believe that, and this is one of their stated beliefs, that it's not just a racial thing, it's a class thing. And they believe that class struggle is universal and transcends all race and all ethnic boundaries. And so they united much more in terms of the poor and the working class than they did along the lines of race. But growing up in Oakland, that was a very predominantly black community at the time. And so we see, a very large African-American presence in the Black Panthers, obviously, but it was a big emphasis on class struggle, right? So they have some of the Marxist elements there. But unfortunately, they ended up being discredited. And finally, we have a series of assassinations, right? That's part of what the civil rights movement is unfortunately marked by, is this series of assassinations. First is John F. Kennedy on November 22nd of 1963. This is probably one of the most controversial and conspiracy theories, and probably one of the conspiracy theories that holds the most weight. So Lee Harvey Oswald will be the man held responsible for the shooting of JFK. But of course, there's lots of things that don't match up. Oswald is actually shot and killed 2 days later by a man named Jack Ruby, and the whole thing was caught on live TV. So not only do people experience the president being shot, but then everyone's watching as Oswald comes out and is being transferred, and then Jack Ruby runs up and shoots that guy, shoots Oswald. So it's a very odd situation. I'm going to let you guys look into all the conspiracy theories and see what you think, but they're out there. After the killing of JFK, right, his reputation grows, like we've talked about, and sort of he becomes memorialized. Next up is Malcolm X. He's killed February 21st, 1965, reportedly by members of the Nation of Islam who disagreed with him over a lot of his teachings. But of course, there's controversy surrounding that one as well, though JFK one is probably a little bit more solid there. And then we have Martin Luther King Jr., who's killed April 6th, 1968 by James Earl Ray. His assassination, very much too, will be sort of this transition point in the civil rights movement. It officially ends this phase, which began in Greensboro, right? We'd seen the split already starting to take place, but with his death, it's really the end of that nonviolent civil disobedience, that activism, right, like the Greensboro sit-ins and things like that. After his assassination, there would be rioting in over 100 cities in the United States. There's over 700 fires, 75,000 troops are sent out to restore order, and over 3,000 people are injured and 46 dead by the end of the riots. And finally, RFK, Robert F. Kennedy, so John F. Kennedy's little brother. Robert Kennedy was assassinated in 1968 as well on June 6th, just a few months later, or a few months after Martin Luther King's assassination. And he was killed just after winning the California primary for the Democratic Party in 1968 in the presidential election. He was a very promising Democratic candidate. He likely could have won the nomination and could have gone on to win the presidency, taking out Nixon. But instead, he's killed by a man named Sirhan Sirhan, who was also arrested and convicted for his assassination and is currently serving a life sentence, although it is still questionable whether or not he is the lone gunman. The last 3 slides of this lecture are on the beginning of your lecture for Vietnam. Thanks, guys. Have a good night.